So, this week we are going to be talking about the visual arts, and this is an amazing place to examine the way that anger is displayed and concealed. Sometimes it's in our face, and sometimes we have to know a little bit more about the artist or the subject or the art to understand the ways that anger plays a part in the piece. This particular piece, for instance, is called Angry Woman or Women, sorry, and I double checked the title of the piece in a couple of different places because it is plural. It is Angry Women. It's a painting by Miriam Kartal, a contemporary artist, Turkish, uses oil and mixed techniques in his work. I can't find too much about the artist itself, but the works I've seen by them are really striking. The topic of anger and art, of course, could be its own class. Um, so what we're going to look at this week is really a very small and I will admit idiosyncratic look at some pieces and some of the ways that our course themes can be seen in the visual arts. It's also going to move backward through time. We're going to start with some more contemporary works and kind of work our way back to the Renaissance. Um, if the topic interests you, your final essay would be a great opportunity to spend some more time exploring art and anger. I decided to just take a look at a few of my favorite examples across time as a way to get a brief introduction to the topic. It's really all the course allows. It's not going to be exhaustive by any means, but it's some of the artists that I feel like most show us depictions of anger and some who make other people angry with their art. Um, so yeah, let's get started. So one of the first groups actually that I wanted to talk about today is the Guerrilla Girls. And the Guerrilla Girls are a group that have both pointed out um, cases of anger in art, have pointed out reasons for us to be angry about art, and have made other people angry with their activism. You may have heard about them before. They say on their website that they're an intersectional feminist anonymous activist group. They came to the art scene in the mid 1980s, and as their website describes, they, quote, use disruptive headlines, outrageous visuals, and killer statistics to expose gender and ethnic bias and corruption in art, film, politics, and pop culture. Um, the Guerrilla Girls movement, however, has been criticized for being essentialist and failing to do a good job with the intersectionality that they propose that they have. Like like many organizations that arose out of second wave feminism, there was room for growth in these areas, of course. As the organization has matured, so has their approach to art, feminism, and intersectionality. And even as we can critique their approach, I think we can also appreciate the important work that they've done to draw attention to the biases in art and art history that have left us with only a few quote unquote exceptional artists. The Guerrilla Girls have also become a part of the institutions that they have critiqued. Whether this is for good or for bad may be something for us to keep an eye on as history progresses. Um, for instance, I found that the Tate Modern currently has an exhibit about the Guerrilla Girls. So the very institutions that they were critiquing, they've now become a part of, and this may or may not be a good thing. We'll have to see. So the first artist, individual artist that I'd like to talk about is Louise Fishman. Louise Fishman was alive 1939 to 2021, sorry. And the paintings here are created during the height of the second wave feminist movement. Um, Fishman's 1973 abstract expressionist art series of 30 paintings called Angry Women used the names of other women artists and activists. Um, Interestingly, I knew about Fishman before, but I didn't know a lot about them as an artist. And I learned that they earned their MFA in painting and printmaking at the University of Illinois in 1965. So that's kind of a cool connection to our state. A news story about her art being exhibited at the U of I explains that Fishman is known for large-scale paintings that demonstrate a strong physicality in the manipulation of paint and sweeping brushstrokes, and for the feminist and queer perspectives reflected in her work. I like these particular paintings and this series for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that even though it's abstract art, I think that many of us can look at it and understand pretty viscerally the kind of message that Fishman was trying to create here. These are only a selection of the works that she created for this series. I encourage you to go out and look at some of the other ones. They're really fascinating. Um, and expression abstract art especially was a very masculine field. It was not something that women participated in great numbers, and so Fishman stands out for that as well. While Fishman's work can be especially overt, other artists incorporate themes that we could view as anger maybe in more subtle ways. Betty Saar is one of the artists mentioned in the brief history reading that I have for you this week. Saar worked in the medium of assemblage, which pieces together found objects, and her work often incorporates the mammy figure. And so this is part of what makes it both um, really challenging to the institution, but also I think reveals the kind of anger that I was hoping to find artists to represent for us this week. Um, the piece in the article shows us a Molotov cocktail made with a wine jug with the mammy figure on the label. The piece on the left here is her Liberation of Aunt Jemima, which Sarr considered her iconic piece and is probably the most well known of her works, at least to those of us who are not deeply entrenched in the art community. This was a piece that I have seen many times before, and one that had come to mind for me when I was thinking about this week's materials. The piece, there's a lot going on in this piece, especially considering it's only about the size of a shoebox. It's like 12 inches tall. The figure has a broom in one hand, a rifle in the other. That mix of domesticity and violence, I think, can hit on many different levels. It also makes me think a little bit of the Miranda Lambert song Gunpowder and Lead. We're going to talk more about music next week. You might hold that in the back of your mind. The image within the outline of the woman shows a similar woman, another mammy figure, holding a crying white child. One author explains that the piece repositions a derogatory figurine, a product of Americans' deep-seated history of racism, as an armed warrior. The activist Angela Davis, in fact, credits this particular piece with launching the Black women's movement. That's a pretty astounding thing to say about a 12-inch piece of artwork. And very cool, I might add, at least from my perspective. The middle work here is called The Edge of Ethics, and Sarr explained that the cage, an object of containment for me, became a metaphor for many concepts, ideas of limitations, of emotions, of racism, of feminism, of death, of beauty, of mystery, of legends, and superstition. And I thought that that was really cool. The bird cage, of course, something that we saw in last week's material, something that we will continue to see. It especially will come back again when we talk about the novel Speak, and that novel's connection to Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. The piece on the right is called Imitation of Life, and like the piece on the left, Sarr incorporates again the mammy figure. The figurine balances on a platform of white teeth, which the Hammer Museum, which houses the piece, suggests represents white lies. And the stopwatch and the slave auction notices behind the inside of the box, and I know it's kind of hard to see that in such a small representation, reference time ticking away and time past. Excuse me. So that's Betty Saar. She was born in 1926, and as far as I know, knock on wood, continues to be alive today. Taking a great big leap from the second wave of feminism in the 1970s and 80s back to the first wave of feminism, although we know that that's a misnomer because women were fighting for justice long before the 19th century. This painting incorporates a lot of feminist ideas. It doesn't Okay, so both figures we can see are wearing rich fabrics, which suggests that they have financial resources, but neither one of them looks particularly happy. Money can't buy happiness, I guess. The feminine figure on the left is looking out the window at a group of musicians and dancers, and her arms extended in a classic art gesture of longing. On the viewer's side of the window, so on our side of the window, we see broken jewelry on the floor, which suggests maybe a rejection of the riches, just as the discarded open book on the floor can be seen as a rejection of knowledge. And we see a caged bird again in the upper right-hand corner, which often refers, of course, to represent groups that are confined by social restrictions. And it's even more striking when we notice the bird outside the window flying free. I find this painting particularly striking for the expression on the masculine presenting figure. He doesn't seem particularly happy with the arrangement either. And while we have started more more contemporarily in some of our broader conversations about how gender expectations and roles are not good for anyone trapped in them, masculine or feminine, um, or anywhere in between. Those especially those binary restrictions are particularly limiting. I find it interesting that this representation of those themes is over 100 years old. So Evelyn de Morgan, or sorry, it should be 1855 to 1919, often associated with the pre-Raphaelite movement. Her content was spiritualist, which is a belief of being able to communicate with the spirits, feminist, and pacifist. This painting is from 1919 and seems to be her last known work. So this last little bit of the conversation about art, we're going to skip back another several centuries, about 250, 300 years here from the De Morgan piece. I'm being a little cheeky, but I'm also being quite serious when I call it plausible deniability in the Renaissance. Um, Women painting in the Renaissance, there were not a ton of women painting in the Renaissance, but we do know of several. We have some really important pieces by them. Um, we're able to cover any anger that they might have been trying to express by painting the kinds of classical images that were expected of any artist at the time. Often, though, when we look at some of these images, we see the ways that the artist chose a particular moment of the story to highlight, the way we see in the Elisabetta Serrani piece um, and Artemisia Gentileschi works highlighted in our reading this week. I know that the article talked about both of these paintings, but I wanted to spend a little more time talking about each of them in relation to some other treatments of the same subjects by artists of the period. So indulge me a little here. So here's the Elisabetta Serrani work from the article that we read for this week. Serrani was alive 1638 to 1665, which is a pretty short life, especially for such an accomplished artist. She may have been poisoned by a maidservant, so I would love to go read more about that just because that's the kind of thing that's, true crime podcast kind of thing for me. Um, she trained at her father's studio, created about 200 paintings. I mean, look at that age and then think about 200 paintings, 15 etchings, and hundreds of drawings. Um, she chose to sign her paintings, which was unusual at the time for any artist and especially unusual for a female artist. Um, all of her works, and I haven't seen all of the works, but according to the stuff I read about her for this week, all of her works featured women. Um, that's really pretty cool. Um, and so the story of Timoclea, which is the one depicted in this artwork on the slide, is from Plutarch's Life of Alexander. Very briefly, in case you haven't read Plutarch lately, I know I haven't. The story goes that Alexander's army invaded Thebes and his soldiers pillaged the city. One of Alexander's captains raped Timoclea. After the rape, he asked Timoclea if there was any money hidden nearby because clearly she'd be inclined to tell him that. Um, Sarcasm? Excuse me. Um, and she said, yeah, of course, and led him to a well where she said the money was hidden. I love these women in the classical stories. They just they rock. When the captain bent over the well, she pushed him in and then dropped stones down on him until he died. Timoclea was arrested and taken to Alexander, but the story goes that she was so well comported that Alexander released her without punishment. Um, I want to point out that if we look at Serrani's painting on the left, she's not just pushing him over the edge. It's not like she just used gravity to help her get him down there. Like, this woman is pushing him. I would argue that that shows a great deal of anger, and strength and composure. The brief article I selected for us this week mentions that many of the other depictions of the story during the Renaissance focus on Timoclea standing before Alexander to accept his judgment. The image on the right is one such version. It's by Alessandro, also an Italian artist, and is dated to 1615, so a few decades before the Serrani image. While they both depict a story from classical literature, the emphasis of each is, of course, striking. The difference between the moment of justice that Timoclea creates, or rather that Serrani creates, and the moment of so-called mercy that Alexander, oh, sorry. It would help if I read my own notes more clearly. While they both depict a story from classical literature, the emphasis of each is striking. The difference between the moment of justice Timoclea creates and the moment of so-called mercy that Alexander offers. The difference between the active and the passive Timoclea is really striking to me. And now we come to my favorite Renaissance woman painter. And yes, I do have a famous Renaissance woman painter. Artemisia Gentileschi, born 1593, died 1650, and my picture is hiding the final date, so indulge me. Artemisia Gentileschi was born in Rome. Her father was a painter. She studied in his workshop. She has a highly naturalistic approach, which I think you will agree, looking at her work. The Artemisia Gentileschi painting is just as striking a difference to me as the Serrani painting was, even though she paints the same moment that other artists depict. This particular comparison is Gentileschi's version, dating to 1620. There is a similar version that dates to 1611, 1612, but I actually prefer this version, in part because I don't know why, but I really like the golden gown on Judith. The painting on the right is by Caravaggio, admittedly one of the Renaissance masters, and it dates to either 1598, 99, or 1602. I couldn't quite find clarification of why we don't have a more specific date, but anyway, it's a few decades before Artemisia's painting. The story of Judith is from the Book of Judith, which is sometimes included in the Bible depending on one's sect and sometimes in the Apocrypha. The story goes that Judith, a widow, tricked Holofernes, an Assyrian general who had besieged her city. She got him drunk, then used his own sword to behead him. Oh, darn. I'm struck by the way that the two images are so very similar. When you put them next to each other like this, it's clear that that Gentileschi must have seen the Caravaggio, and she did study in Caravaggio's workshop for a while, so it's likely that she had seen and was familiar with the work. But I'm not really sure that that explains the similarity completely, at least in my mind. I think that Gentileschi wanted viewers to recall the earlier image, but if we look, the Gentileschi image shows the women as much more active, strong, and committed to the task. Caravaggio's Judith doesn't look like she's really got the strength to cut through a man's neck. Um, and the maid servant is so passive and behind her, where in Artemisia's painting, they're both there. They're both fighting this massive man. Um, I have to tell you that as I was writing up these notes, I had podcasts playing in the background because my ADHD kind of demands that there's always noise. Um, and in a bizarre convergence, at least in my brain, the podcast that was playing as I wrote this particular slide referenced Gentileschi and this work. It was like, wait, did I just hear that right? But the podcaster noted that Caravaggio was the only previous artist to depict Judith in the act of slaying her Holofernes. So that makes it even more interesting to me that Gentileschi chose to recreate this very moment in her piece. I'll wrap up the content for this part of the video with two other Gentileschi paintings. The one on the left depicts a moment from the biblical book of Judges. This is the story of the Canaanite general Sisera, who is defeated by the Israelites and flees. Jael, the woman, takes him in, promising to feed him and hide him. Only when he fell asleep, she drove a stake through his temple and killed him. The image on the right is one of Gentileschi's self-portraits. This one depicts her as the allegory of painting, which was pretty bold. Not only was she asserting herself as a female artist at a time when that was still kind of rare, but she does so claiming to be the actual embodiment of art. As the reading mentioned, Gentileschi was raped by her art teacher, Agostino Tassi. When Tassi reneged on the promise to marry her, Artemisia's father pressed charges against Tassi. Think back to what I said last week about women being men's property, especially in the Renaissance. So it wasn't for Artemisia to press charges or for the law to prosecute Tassi for violating Artemisia, but rather for her father to prosecute Tassi for violating his property. It's horrible, but it's the way it was. The really messed up bit to me is that Artemisia was the one tortured with thumb screws. Keep in mind, this woman is an artist, her hands, everything, tortured with thumb screws during the trial to try to ensure the truthfulness of her testimony. The reason I bring it up again is that many art critics make an argument, and I'm pretty convinced by it, that triangulates these two paintings with the story of her rape. You can see that there are pretty striking similarities between the images of Gentileschi and Jael. I would need a pretty convincing argument that the similarities are accidental. I mean, maybe it exists, but I haven't heard it yet. So if we grant the similarities and we could imagine that Jael is a representation of Gentileschi, it's not a leap to align Sisera and Tassi. Tassi, perhaps not uncoincidentally, had dark hair. Others have noticed similarities between Sisera and Tassi's appearances. Whether or not the argument is convincing to you, I suspect you'll at least recognize the possibility that Gentileschi could have been imagining herself taking the physical revenge that she never realized in real life. One might argue that her greater reputation in the history of art, Tassi is almost only remembered as Gentileschi's rapist, and his linking with that rape conviction is a cosmic justice that she may not have even thought to hope for, but one that I personally can celebrate a little bit. So for our discussion this week, I'd like you to do a little research. Google image search is fine. Find a work of visual art not mentioned in our readings or my slide deck that you think fits the discussion this week. Feel free to choose another piece by an artist that has been mentioned. Just use the piece that we haven't talked about yet or that wasn't mentioned in the article. Art, for the purpose of this discussion, can be interpreted quite broadly. Just like last week, we looked at the Banksy piece, which some could argue was graffiti and not a high art. I give you leeway to talk about art, visual art, in whatever way makes sense to you in the context of this discussion. Please either include an image of the piece in your post or give us a link so that we can view it too. If you have trouble locating work to discuss, drop me an email. I'll help you find one that you might like to use. Initial response to the prompt is due, as usual, no later than midnight on Thursday, July 6th, and a response to at least one of your classmates no later than midnight on July 9th, Sunday. Also this week, we have a reflective essay assignment. That assignment is posted. It does not require additional research. It's a 2 to 4 page paper. I've given you some guiding questions. Look them over. Let me know what questions you have. My office hours, even though today is technically a university holiday, I'll go ahead and log on from 5 to 6:30 for my online office hours. If those times don't work for you, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll find something that does. And I will be working on completing the grading for last week in the next day or two, so keep an eye out for those posts. Let me know if you have any questions. I have thoroughly enjoyed so far getting to read your responses and your reading notes, content notes. Y'all are doing amazing, and I am so excited to be learning with you this class. As usual, here are some of the works, well, the works I cited in the discussion today. Take care, everybody, and find some time for joy this week.